Let me welcome you all to the 9th book Adda since its inception in February of 2015. This has been a series that we created 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, and it has been very stimulating for us. So we continue to do so. I'm Ashutosh Vaishnav, Director of Contemporary South Asia and Center for Contemporary South Asia, and Professor of Political Science here. And our speaker today is Milan Vaishnav, and the book we are discussing was published earlier this year, When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, published by Yale University Press. I actually read this book for the press, reviewed it for the press, so I'm reading parts of from my commentary for the press, which Milan is familiar with. He knows that this is what I wrote. This is the first systematic book-length treatment of a peculiar paradox of Indian politics, namely the coexistence of criminality and democratic vigor. No one questions anymore that India's elections are hugely competitive. Indeed, at a low level of income, few democracies have survived for so long ever in history. Adam Przeworski has produced a list of about 6 of them, 7, I think. And 7 only. But over the last 3 decades, a substantial number of candidates with serious cases of criminality, though yet to be fully convicted, have fought and won elections. And I think Milan will tell us whether this is the right formulation, yet to be fully convicted, whether this is the right way to phrase the problem. Political parties across the ideological spectrum seek such candidates. Moreover, voters vote for them, despite their knowledge of their criminal records. Even more surprisingly, despite the participation of criminals in politics, elections, it is now clear, are not stolen in India. The book then revolves around 4 questions. 1, given that criminals in many polities function at the periphery of politics, what explains why criminals have come directly to participate in Indian politics? Running for office, not simply supporting politicians from outside, which is a much more common phenomenon in democratic politics worldwide. Supporting politicians from outside as opposed to criminals running for office. 2, given that it's natural to expect parties to keep their reputations clean, why do they select candidates with serious criminal records? 3, given that voters generally have a choice between candidates who have an untarnished record and those who are criminals, why do they vote for criminals? In the 2004 and 2009 parliamentary elections, and I'm sure Milan has calculated this number for 2014 as well, to quote from the manuscript, a candidate with a criminal case was on average 3 times as likely to win elections than a candidate with no criminal cases. A candidate with a criminal case was 3 times as likely to win a parliamentary election than a candidate with no criminal cases. And fourthly, given that one would normally expect that criminals, if elected, would undermine democracy and accountability, is it the case that they do undermine democracy and accountability in India or not? So with these orienting questions, which this book deals with, you can see how intellectually significant and politically important these questions are. With these 4 questions, I would like to introduce our speaker today, and I'll introduce the 3 commentators later. Milan is now the director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a leading think tank in this country, and now emerging as a significant think tank in India as well, with its Delhi office. He was educated at University of Pennsylvania, where he took his BA, then Columbia University, where he took his PhD in political science, with a dissertation which finally became this book. The title of the dissertation was The Merits of Money and Muscle. Other than this book, he has also published an edited volume, 2 edited volumes, one with Devesh Kapoor and Pratap Mehta, both have spoken here. And that edited volume, published earlier this year as well, was entitled Rethinking Public Institutions in India. And more than 10 years ago, an edited volume with Nancy Birdsall and Robert Ayers, Short of the Goal, US Policy Toward Poorly Performing States. This perhaps he did when he was at the Center for Global Development, before joining Columbia, I would think, as a PhD student. Yeah. The format is as follows. Milan will speak for up to 25 minutes on his book, and then we'll have 3 commentators, each of which I will introduce, and they'll have up to 20 minutes. I will moderate the discussion thereafter, and we'll open up for, after the commentary of the commentators, Milan will speak, will respond to their comments, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Milan Vaishnav.
Thank you very much, Ashu, for that very kind and generous introduction. Thank you first and foremost for the comments on the book, which hopefully I've done adequate justice to. And I want to thank Adam, Jeff, and Prerna in advance for their comments. I don't know what they're going to say, but I'm sure that I'm going to learn a lot from them. And thanks, of course, to all of you who are here. I first came to Brown when Ashu was leading the Brown India Initiative. At my second visit to Brown, he's leading the Center for Contemporary South Asia. On my next visit, I think world domination is probably the only thing left that you have to accomplish. So thanks again for being here. Let me just begin with a story, if I might. This is a gentleman by the name of Pappu Yadav. Pappu Yadav is a prominent politician in the North Indian state of Bihar. He got his start as a young man extorting local businesses, engaging in various dodgy black market deals, working as a hired gun for political parties. He blossomed into a self-style mafia don, what they call in North India as a bahubali, so literally a sort of strong man. A journalist who once profiled Pappu said that he had a physique of a baby elephant and the reputation of a raving, stampeding one. At the ripe old age of 23, he had accumulated so much clout that he decided to turn his criminal career into a political one, putting his name forward for the Bihar State Assembly, his very first election, which he handily won. And within 2 years, he stood again, this time for a seat in India's national parliament, making the transition from state to national politics on his very first try. Pappu's luck would run out in 2008. He was convicted and given a life sentence for murdering a political rival in cold blood. Now, for most of us, you might think our political career would stop after that point. Not so with Pappu. He did the next best thing, which was to recruit his wife to run in his stead. She stood for election to national parliament and won her seat. In 2013, due to some irregularities with the prosecution's case, Pappu's conviction was overturned. He was once again a free man. He was greeted in this picture you see here outside of his jail cell by hundreds of well-wishers who greeted him with great cheer. His next move was rather interesting. He decided to write a political memoir entitled A Solo Traveler During a Time of Rebellion. Far from running away from him, leaders of India's political elite rushed towards him. Invitations to his glitzy Delhi book launch were secured by a veritable who's who of political party leaders. Within a year, he decided once more to enter the electoral fray, winning a seat in parliament along with his wife. They are today the only husband and wife couple in Indian parliament. Now, Pappu Yadav is clearly a man of very special skills, very special talents. If you were to Google, India gangster politician, he would probably be among the top hits. But this nexus between crime and politics is actually far more widespread. This is a map of India broken up into its 543 national parliamentary constituencies, its electoral districts. Those areas you see in bright orange are areas that have a representative in the parliament who has a criminal case against him or her. Now, what is a criminal case? These are not convictions, but they are also more than police charges. These are instances where charges have been filed, a judge has taken cognizance of a case and has framed charges against the individual. So there is some judicial proceeding which is underway. What's interesting to note is that these splotches of bright orange actually are quite widespread. So many of us, including myself, work with a mental model of India which thinks of a relatively rural, poorer, backward North India, maybe a slightly richer, more industrialized, more urban South India. But you see here that criminality seems to know no geographic boundaries, right? I mean, literally in all corners of the country, you see some of these bright orange colors. Let me show you this data in a slightly different way. This is data from the last 3 general elections, 2004, 2009, and 2014. And what I have here on the y-axis are percentage of lower house members of parliament who have either criminal cases, which are those in black. Those in orange are MPs with serious cases. Now, what's a serious case? So leave aside all of those things which could be plausibly, politically linked to a politician's vocation. Things like libel, slander, defamation, even throw in unlawful assembly and rioting. Leave those aside. Focus instead on serious crimes, things like murder, attempted murder, causing grievous injury, physical assault. That's what's in that orange bar. These are things that, if a conviction were obtained, would merit real jail time. Now, there's 3 things to note about this particular figure. Number 1, in 2014, the last general election, 1 in 3 members of parliament had a case proceeding against them in the courts. Number 2 is that the severity of the crime is quite high. So 1 in 5 elected in 2014 had not just a case, but a serious case proceeding against him or her. And the third thing to note is that despite the fact that information about these characters is more widespread than ever before, these numbers seem to be going up rather than going down. So the central puzzle of the book, and this is really the motivation, is how can we have, on the one hand, free and fair elections in a competitive environment, not just a competitive environment, I would go so far as to say a hyper-competitive environment. I mean, in India, you don't speak of contesting elections, you talk about fighting elections. How do you have that on the one hand, yet on the other hand, such a large number of members of parliament, elected officials, actually at every level, local, state, and national, who have not just cases against them, but cases of a serious nature? The great thing we've been told about democracy is that if there are individuals who betray the public trust, voters can use the ballot box to sanction those individuals, right? So in America, we like to say, you throw the rascals out, right? You kick the bums out. What does it mean when we think about democratic accountability if, far from getting kicked out, the rascals actually get kept in? They're not only re-elected, but actually not only elected, but also re-elected. So that's really the central motivation of the book. The analogy that I use in the book is that, politics sort of function like a market. I mean, obviously there's a difference between economic markets and political markets, but they both have in common that they're underlying supply and demand factors that make the market work. So there's sort of two questions over here. One is on the supply side, which is why do political parties embrace candidates who have these serious criminal backgrounds? That is, why are they injecting supply into the marketplace? And then the other question on the demand side is, okay, why is it that voters, again, in what are genuinely recognized in free and fair elections with many competitive parties, with many candidates, with very low margins of victory, do voters vote for them? Just to give you a little preview of the argument, on the supply side, I argue that elections have become exceedingly costly in India, and parties have not dedicated themselves organizationally to coping with this fiscal challenge. And so, therefore, they are thrust into the embrace of individuals who have deep pockets. And criminals or suspected criminals are one demographic which has a lot of money and the willingness to spend that money. The more interesting question in my mind actually is, or the bigger puzzle is the demand side, right? What's going on with the voters and the voters' minds? And here the argument is that in a context where the rule of law is weak or uneven and social divisions run deep, that criminality can actually signal the credibility to get stuff done, to actually be a good representative, okay? And I'm going to walk you through both sides of the supply and demand argument. Before I do that, let me just say a quick word about methodology. The bedrock for this book is an unprecedented source of data which came available as of 2003. In 2003, the Supreme Court of India ruled in a landmark judgment that anyone who stands for political office at the time of filing their nomination papers has to submit a sworn judicial affidavit, which looks something like this, which details their financial assets and liabilities, their criminal antecedents, and their educational qualifications. This, just by illustration on the right, is Papu Yadav's rap sheet. You can see he's quite prolific. What we did working with computer scientists, building on a lot of good work which had been done by civil society to compile these things, was to create a database of about 70,000 political candidates who contested office at the state level and the national level between 2003 and 2014. To try to understand what are the patterns here of where we see crime, where we see money, and their interaction. Now, these data are very blunt. They are blunt instruments. They are self-reported data. You can imagine all of the issues that might be involved in this data, so it's not enough. So the next level was to spend time in the field trying to understand what is the nature of the interaction between political parties, voters, and candidates, right? What is it that makes this marketplace sort of really tick? So between 2008 and 2014, spent time in a couple of different states, talking to voters, talking to politicians, following political campaigns, including political campaigns of a fellow here on the right named Anand Singh. We'll come back to Anand Singh. Jeff has some experience with Anand Singh, maybe others do as well, a very colorful politician. Having kind of lived at that micro level, we then zoom back out and with other collaborators use some survey instruments at a broader all India level to try to see if some of the patterns that we were picking up in the field actually can be kind of more generalizable, over space. So each one of these methods has their pros and their cons. So trying to kind of triage among these three to present a useful composite picture. All right, so going to the first question on the supply side is why is it that parties nominate candidates with criminal records? Now, the very simple, flippant answer is because they win. In some respects, I could have just sort of stopped my book there and said, well, there you go. This is data on 21,000 candidates who stood for national election over the last three elections, 04, 09, and 14. This is the chance of them winning their election if you have no cases and if you have at least one case, right? You can see that you're 3 times more likely to win if you have a case. Now, that's a very unsatisfying answer because we want to know, well, why is there that difference? Why is there that discrepancy between these two bars, right? One of the arguments I make in the book is that this comes down to money. So as the cost of elections has exploded, Parties have not come up with mechanisms to deal with this rising tide of money, and they need to find a way to plug their fiscal gap. And they're looking for rents, which is how can I get money where I don't actually have to expend a huge degree of cost in order to get that money? And one answer is to find self-financing candidates. Now, what does self-financing mean? It means, number one, people who are willing to pay their own way, so cover the cost of their campaign expenditures. Number two, people who are willing to pay the party the privilege of running under their symbol, right, under their aegis. Number three, people who are willing to subsidize other candidates who may be running on the party label. And four, maybe engage in some rent seeking or look the other way if the party is engaging in some rent seeking, that people are looking for money power. So one simple illustration of this is if you take that same set of 21,000 candidates, what I'm showing you today is primarily data that's at the national level. The book goes through national data and state level data. This is the same group of candidates running for a general election over the past 3 cycles, broken out by how wealthy they are. So on the far left, you have the lowest or the poorest 20%, the bottom quintile. On the far right, you have the top quintile and their chance of winning the election. You could see the huge advantage to winning if you're located in that top quintile, right? More than 20 times more likely to win. Now, okay, well, there are a lot of people with money. But one important demographic who both have money and the incentives to deploy that money in the service of politics are those who are associated with criminal activity. Why? Because A, they want protection, not necessarily because there's any formal immunity once you're an Indian lawmaker. There is no formal immunity. But you have ways in which you can use the levers of power to derail or delay justice. That protects you both against the state as well as against potential rivals. And number two is that politics is a very lucrative business. So that money that you would put forward to win that political campaign is best thought of as an investment that's going to have very high returns once you control the discretionary levers at your disposal once you're in power. So again, just sticking with a simple illustration of this role of these criminal candidates, the median clean candidate. So here, this is a candidate who may have a case, but it's a sort of a minor nature, right? I'm just going to sort of say that's small. It could be plausibly politically motivated. Is worth around 900,000 rupees. The median criminal candidate who has a serious case is worth 4 times as much, right? So there's a clear a money advantage that parties are attracted to muscle power, in part because it brings money along with it. Now, one obvious question to ask is, well, there are a lot of people these days in India with money. You have industrialists, you have business people, you have cricket players, you have Bollywood stars, right? I mean, there's lots of demographics. But there seems to be something special about those who have a criminal background. So this is the same chart I showed you before of the wealth advantage. Here, all I've done is broken out that wealth advantage by people who have serious criminal backgrounds and those who don't. At every level of wealth, there's still a premium above and beyond money that's associated with somebody who has this criminal background. All right, so money may be an important part of the explanation, but it can't be the full explanation, right? There's something else going on, and that's where I think you have to bring in the demand side, right? What else is it that criminal candidates are delivering to the constituents, to political parties, that allows them to be so successful? The argument that I make in the book is that in a context where the rule of law is weak, government is not seen as an impartial arbiter or effective arbiter of public goods, the things we associate with sovereign kind of Weberian states, and in places where social divisions are rife, politicians use their criminality to signal their credibility to protect the interests of their constituents. Now the question is, what does this protection look like and how does this protection work? So in the book, I talk about 4 different mechanisms. I won't go into great detail here. I'll just quickly mention them. The first is using their criminal bona fides to intervene in the process of redistribution, the administration of benefits. If somebody isn't getting a ration card, going to the block development officer and threatening them that if you don't give this, then there's going to be hell to pay. That's one mechanism. The second is coercion. So in a situation where the police are not widely seen as fair or impartial, if there's a challenge of a security or law and order type, both to protect yourself as well as to fend off any potential rival groups, they're often able to provide a kind of coercive element of protection. The third is social insurance, right? Life is uncertain, especially if you're a poverty line or below poverty line household where you may experience some kind of shock, say it's a death in the family or a wedding where you have to suddenly come up with cash. These are people who can be a kind of creditor of last resort, right, in your time of need when you really need them the most. And last but not least is dispute resolution, right? Given how deeply entrenched the infirmities are of the Indian justice system, right? You have a situation today where you have about 31.5 million pending cases around the country winding their way through the courts. If you have a dispute with your neighbor, a simple property dispute, right, you want to have some closure to solve that issue, and you need someone who has the status and authority to actually enforce a settlement. Now, there's two ingredients to the argument, right? One is this idea of that these people are maybe substituting or augmenting publicly provided services or services that should be publicly provided. But the second is that we're likely to see this activity more intensely where there are very salient and deep social cleavages. So the previous slide was about protection. This slide is really about interests. How do people conceive of their interests? One of the things that I found in every place that I went is that these interests are not strictly material, right? They're tied up with a sense of status, a sense of what we call in India the politics of dignity, honor, community, that we as a community should have the kind of respect that we deserve, and this politician has the skills to make sure that our position is locked in. So we may be a group that has been historically disenfranchised that's trying to break through, but the previously dominant group is trying to keep us down. Or it could be from the opposite end, groups which had been traditionally dominant, which see their grip eroding over time. What this means is that it's in the interests of these politicians to use sectarian divisions to slice and dice the electorate into smaller bite-sized chunks. And remember, this is a situation in India where we have a first-past-the-post electoral system. So in many electoral districts, you can win an election with 30% of the vote, right? So if you can bring your community on board, maybe a few allied communities, you don't necessarily have to cater to everyone. What does this look like in practice? So this is Anand Singh, the individual I mentioned briefly. This was his re-election poster in 2010. This was a picture that was taken in a rural village in Bihar. You can see the kind of thatched roof at the top. And I have to admit, when I first saw this, I was a little bit puzzled. Right? I mean, why is this a compelling advertisement for a candidate, right? I mean, I was born and brought up in the United States, and we see the beautiful pictures of families and the kids and the yellow lab, and right, this is something very different. Then I remembered that this was the big Bollywood blockbuster hit of 2010, Dabangg. Some of you probably have seen this movie. So what is the story of Dabangg? Dabangg is the story of a cop, Inspector Pandey, Robin Hood Pandey is called, played by Salman Khan, who's a kind of crooked cop with a sympathetic streak, right? And he does bad, but he does bad in order to do good, right? So this resemblance between Anand Singh and Inspector Pandey is not incidental, right? It's purposive. That people are actually voting for Anand Singh, not in spite of his criminality, but actually because of it, because they see that, again, as a sign of his credibility. I remember sitting down with a highly educated engineer who was a constituent in Anand Singh's area, and that same day the newspaper had printed a story talking about all of his alleged illegal transgressions. And I said, but how can you vote for this guy? It says right here, he's in X many murder cases, there was an assault case. And they said, this man said, you don't understand. Anand Singh is not a murderer. He merely manages murder. Okay? But that puzzled me for a while. And then what I realized he was saying is, Anand Singh is the CEO of our protection racket. and I'm one who's being protected. You come from the big city and you call him evil and you do all this, all of that is irrelevant, right? Look at what he's doing to us and where we would be if Anand Singh was not around. Okay. I'm going to just say a quick word about what I think we can do about this if you find this to be a problem from a public policy standpoint. And I think the solution to the issue has to be twofold, right? You have to address both the supply and demand parts of this challenge. So number one, on the supply side, clearly in the short term, reformers have to address one of the key proximate drivers, which is political finance, right? So there's sort of three cardinal rules about how political finance in India works. Number one, there's zero transparency about political contributions and the sources of political finance. Number two is that there is no independent audit of political parties in the country. And number three, you have a very powerful election commission, one of the most powerful election agencies in the world, which has many authorities are actually outdated. They go back to 1951, 1952 during the time of the first general election. And so they're unable to actually deal with some of the new ways in which this money power plays out. So that's what you can do on the supply side. Now, what about the demand side? In the long run, the ultimate solution is to deal with the governance issue at hand. Now, this is not my picture. This is a very famous picture of Jan Bonnings from a North Indian kind of clerk's office. The reason I like this picture is because it sums up everything that's wrong with the Indian state in one picture, right? What is this picture? You have one woman sitting all alone in this office, vast office with all of this paperwork, right? And so there's two issues, primary issues with the Indian state. The first is that it's highly over-bureaucratized in procedural terms, but highly under-bureaucratized in personnel terms. Right? So we often have these debates about how do you get the state to be more effective, and they usually devolve into some version of you need to grow the state, you need to cut the state, and we kind of go back and forth. Similar debates take place in our country as well. Really the answer is you sort of have to right-size the state, right? You have to kind of bring this red tape and this personnel into greater balance. So you need to trim the fat while actually strengthening some of the muscle, right? So I think both of these policy challenges are worth keeping in mind. Let me just end here, since I'm almost out of time, about the larger lessons for emerging democracies or other democracies outside of India. I think number one is, I think sometimes we have a tendency to underestimate voters. This resonates a lot with me after November 8th, 2016, that oftentimes voters are much smarter than we think and have actually pretty clearly defined rationales for why they vote the way they do, even though at a surface level it might seem irrational or illogical. Number two is, don't ignore what I call the money primary. So the money primary is a well-identified concept in the American politics literature, right? You have an election coming around, people go out and show you how much money they can raise. The people who show they can raise a lot of money get to stay in. The people who can't raise any money, they fall by the wayside. Now, India obviously doesn't have a formal primary system, but the same kind of dynamic is at work. I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about what are the implications of narrowing the talent pool in such a way that only people who have deep pockets actually are able to be competitive. It's almost impossible to make it if you aren't one of those people. The third point, and probably the one where I've gotten the most pushback, especially from my civil society friends, is that sunlight is not always the best disinfectant. Right? We have, I certainly have an implicit bias thinking that we need more transparency, and I think transparency is something worth fighting for. I mean, frankly, one could not have done a study such as this unless we had transparency about who these politicians are. But the point over here is that it's not always the silver bullet that we'd hope for, right? The binding constraint on why voters vote for a Papu Yadav or another criminal politician is not because they lack information, it's because they lack proper governance. Last but not least, recognize democracy in action. That these criminal politicians are winning some of the most competitive elections anywhere around the world. And I think it's much more helpful to think about them not as subnational autocrats who are going around capturing elections, stealing ballot boxes. You're not able to really do that in today's India. But they're actually acting as representatives of the people. Now, that democratic accountability which results is not perfect. It is not complete. It is not, it is highly partial. And I think we have to recognize that it's a flawed version. It sort of grates on our normative ideas, but I do think that it's a more useful frame through which to think about this problem. Thank you very much.
This is a political science book, When Crime Pays, but we were very keen on inviting an anthropologist to comment on these materials. And Jeffrey Witsoe is a person we chose because his book on Bihar, Democracy Against Development, Lower Caste Politics and Political Modernity in Post-Colonial India, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2013, educated us political scientists a lot. It gave us the kind of insight that that can only emerge from ethnography or ethnographic observation. So Jeffrey is our next speaker. He was educated at the University of Cambridge, where he took his PhD in social and cultural anthropology, and is now a professor at Union College in New York.
Thanks for that introduction, Ashu. It's great to be here. So this is an important book. I don't want to go over everything that Milan already described, but it is asking, I think, a fundamental question for understanding contemporary India. Why is the governance of elections and the sanctity of the secret ballot, right, the ability of citizens to freely vote, all markedly improved at the same time as more criminals are being elected? I think the book is very well written. I think the movement between vignettes and analysis is particularly effective. The book is accessible to a range of readers and yet manages to maintain analytical rigor, which I think is really impressive. I think it's a model in many ways. More books should be written like this. Good job. I think it's an excellent book. I'm not going to go over Milan's main argument. There are a couple of points that I do want to make. So at its most intellectually ambitious, the book persuasively argues that the election of criminal politicians is not best considered a breakdown of democratic accountability or representation. That's what he referred to at the end. He argues that a lack of information is not the reason why so many people vote for criminal politicians. Quite the contrary. And I completely agree with this. I mean, everyone who knows how things work in a place like Bihar, and I'm going to be focusing quite a lot on Bihar because it's the state that I know best, and it's also a state that features quite prominently in the book. Everyone knows these guys. When you're hanging out in chai stalls or in kind of on the veranda of houses where men sit and talk about politics, they're constantly talking about the exploits of these criminal politicians. So people have an abundance of information. It's quite the reverse of kind of informational asymmetries. This implies, I think, that the concepts of democratic accountability and representation need to be rethought in the Indian context, and this is a point that I'm going to return to. But I want to focus on 2 points, two key points of the argument. The first is the role of money, which I think is an important part of the supply of criminal politicians, and I basically agree with the point. I think it's important. The one thing that I do want to point out is that the money of criminal politicians is different than the money of other candidates, say industrialists, right? Because the money that criminal politicians bring are connected to very dense networks. Right? And it's these networks through which the money is accumulated and distributed. And it's the same network through which the protection rackets that he mentioned are run. All right? And if you actually study the distribution of cash during elections, you find that it's through these exact same networks that the cash is distributed as well. So if you're sitting in like even a small part of a village, you'll find, there's somebody sitting there who knows somebody who's actually close with, say, Anand Singh. And so in this way, these networks go right down to the most micro level. And so this is an important point. All right, and so for example, I've studied, say, the brokers who extort money from people below the poverty line who are getting housing through the Indira Awas Yojana, and this guy's somehow connected to someone who's connected to one of these criminal politicians. So this matters, and these networks can be very wide. So I would say even my main kind of primary long-term research site is in Bhojpur district, and one of the key people in what's called the sand mining industry, the sand mafia, is a shooter for Shahabuddin, who's in a totally different part in Siwan in North Bihar. So there's also this huge geographic reach of some of these networks, and so this is a point maybe we'll return to. But there's a second point that actually I want to focus more time on. And this is the key argument in the book about the voter demand for criminal politicians, right? Where the book argues that the rise of criminal politician results from weak state capacity combined with the salience of ethnic divisions, which in India means caste and to some extent religion, right? So in many ways, this is very much in line with what I observed in Bihar during the period of Lalu Yadav, when basically there was a breakdown of governance, widely perceived, breakdown of law and order, at the same time as lower caste political mobilizations polarized and divided society, kind of to an unprecedented degree. And this was also a time when there was a huge increase in criminal politicians, and where these guys had a huge kind of stature. They were big players, central players on the political landscape. The reason that there was a breakdown of governance, however, was a disjuncture between a new lower caste political leadership and a bureaucracy, a police force, a judiciary that was still effectively controlled by upper caste. This is an important point. The rise of criminal politicians was not just to fill a vacuum created by the breakdown of a Weberian state, because a state like this has never existed in a place like Bihar. Rather, to simplify a bit, I mean, you could say for most people, I think the trajectory would have gone something like the zamindar, the landlord, is the state, to a kind of post-independent state where there's kind of a landlord patronage Congress regime where it's all integrated. Now landlords rely on the state and the bureaucracy to maintain dominance through the Congress Party. And then this breaks down to the 1990s with the rise of Mondal and lower caste politics. So criminal politicians filled the vacuum created by the breakdown of state institutions and a Congress Party organization that had long been controlled by landed elites, and that served to reinforce and reproduce their dominance. If it's true that the rise of criminal politicians resulted from weak state capacity, combined with the salience of ethnic divisions, there's a chart in the book on page 328, if anyone has the book open, in Appendix A, that I found, I was really struck by this, actually, when I read it, when I saw it. It really struck me. I thought about it for quite some time. Because what it shows is that the number of criminal politicians in the Bihar Assembly increased pretty dramatically between 2005 and 2010. Topping the list was the BJP, with a full 39% of legislators with serious criminal charges. Think of that, 39%. It's staggering. And even the other party, the next party on the list, that was also part of the ruling alliance, the JDU, increased from 25% to, from 23 to 35%. Right? In fact, the share of all parties increased except for the Congress, but the Congress is a pretty marginal party in Bihar, particularly at this point. So interestingly enough, as a side note, this is also the election where the number of upper caste representation increases for the first time, and OBC lower caste representation decreases for the first time in 15 years. I would actually say this was a pivotal election, like from Mondo, this is kind of going backwards in some ways, in terms of political representation, caste-based political representation. Anyway, that was a side point. I was interested if you kind of had a caste breakdown of the caste of criminal politicians. But 2005 to 2010 is exactly the time that so many people in Bihar commented that the state was being resurrected. And growth rates were very high. For most of this period, Bihar was either the fastest growing state or the second fastest growing state in India, behind Gujarat. And this is also a time when it was widely perceived that ethnic divisions had decreased, right? And law and order had increased also. So it's kind of baffling that at this time there'd be this increase in the number of criminal politicians. So these two questions lead me to a third question, admittedly provocative. What if it's not the breakdown of the state that's responsible for the rise of criminal politicians, but exactly the opposite? I'll return to this question. One thing that strikes me when I think about all the criminal politicians, particularly who I know or who I kind of know their constituency and I kind of know the world that they're helping to shape, is that they all seem to be tied to landlords. And they all seem to be in the business of putting down the organization of laborers. And I'd speculate this is probably true also in urban context, although I don't know that as much about urban context and criminality. For instance, just to give a couple examples, Shahabuddin, just some of the ones, say right from the opening of the book, Shahabuddin, and I've spent a little time in Siwan, and he basically combines like the support of landlords with a new class of Muslim elite who actually migrate to the Gulf and have new forms of cash from remittances. Siwan, interestingly enough, is one of the main places of outmigration to the Gulf in India. All right, and of course he's been accused of murdering several activists with the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist, including the JNU student leader Chandrasekhar Prasad. Suraj Ban, you don't write about, he was in one of those six, and he was a huge figure. Suraj Ban and then Anand Singh both represent the interests of Bhumihar landlords, as does Sunil Pandey, who you mentioned is affiliated with the Ranveer Sena, which is a private militia of Bhumihar landlords. You write, actually, of Anand Singh, quote, "Many Bhumihars favored Anand Singh because they perceived that he was the only candidate with the ability to protect the economic interests of Mokama's upper caste. Many Bhumihars felt that only a Dabang MLA would be able to either slow down or reverse their declining dominance." That was a great quote. And even Papu Yadav, I think, is from a landlord family, although I'm not as familiar with Prerna. And the murder that he was accused of was of Ajit Sarkar, who was a CPI-M leader. And so even the criminal politicians I can think of in Bhojpur, they're all somehow connected with fighting CPI-ML. So it seems to me that most criminal politicians in rural Bihar, at least, seem to be tied to landlords and fights against efforts to organize landless laborers and small farmers. And I'm curious whether you looked at this, when you look at kind of the distribution, does it correlate with, say, concentration of land ownership? Does it correlate with systems of land tenure, right? So I'm thinking of the Banerjee Iyer work, for instance, on this. I think this also helps to explain the lack of Dalit criminal politicians, right? You have a whole section on this. Reservations seem to have its own effect, but still, there doesn't seem to be many. I was struck, for instance, by the relatively few number of BSP candidates, a Dalit-centric party, with pending criminal cases, right? So I want to return to the case of Anand Singh, the most developed, I thought it was the most developed case study in the book, and I thought a very interesting one. Bhumihar landlords in Mokama, I would suggest, would not benefit from a state with the capacity to impartially enforce law, right? So I doubt that they would actually want an impartial and effective system to enforce property rights, because I think they're illegally occupying large amounts of land, and they have for a very long time. This tall land on riverbank land. This is why there's never been a digitization of land records in Bihar. There's never been land consolidation either. Bhumihar landlords would not only lose land if a state capable of impartially enforcing law emerged, they would also need to pay minimum wage, including to women, who, because of migration, are an increasingly important part of agriculture. Right? Women would have a right to work. Right? There would be a functional system of subsidized food rations. Education would function. State institutions really capable and willing to enforce existing law would transform rural society, especially in places like Mokama. And this would completely undermine Bhumihar dominance. So for locally dominant actors, especially landlords, the state has become at best a double-edged sword. So landlords can no longer rely on the party system, the bureaucracy, to maintain their dominance. Instead, perhaps, I'm suggesting, they're turning to criminal politicians who have emerged to fill this vacuum. And this is why so many of these criminal politicians maintain an almost quasi-feudal persona and also practice a quasi-feudal moral economy of limited redistribution that the book presents in some detail. Right, so how much time do I have?
You're out of time.
Oh, I'm out of time. All right, so let me just end with a couple of questions. One, what does this mean if the link to landlords is true? What does this mean for policy? Because I wanted to return to this, and I completely agree with your argument on the need to build state capacity. But the problem is that the same groups that dominate politics in places like Mokama and that support Anand Singh, they have an interest in keeping the state weak. So top-down policy kind of reform is never going to be the solution, right? Rather, there needs to be bottom-up kind of organizing from below, and it's going to involve real political transformation. The people that have dominance right now need to be displaced. That's the only way to end this kind of criminality, if what I'm saying is true. And I think if there's one policy prescription that would have the biggest effect in a place like Bihar, it would be actually effective land reforms. So I'll just end there.
Thank you, Jeff. The paper about, or the point about would provision of more information change voter choice? That point has been made twice, once by Milan and once by Jeff. This is actually a paper that I tried to persuade Abhijit Banerjee and Rohini Pandey not to write, not to publish, when it was first given to me for commentary, and I don't know where it came out finally. It did come out fine. It took about 6, 7, 8 years for them to publish it, actually. I first read it in 2002 or so, when they made the case that if only voters were given better information about candidates, the voters would not choose criminal politicians. And they said they had experimental data on that, and I said I would have very serious doubts about the method which generates this result. And so I want to know how exactly this experiment was conducted, because it doesn't sound credible to me. And both of you have also questioned that. And certainly Milan has questioned that in great detail in his book. But Jeff, I thought the critique you made, there's a tension between 2 points you're making. One, you are, and I don't know how Milan would come out finally, but as a moderator, I'd like to point out that your first point that criminal politicians mainly arose because politics came to be dominated by lower castes, whereas bureaucracy was dominated by upper castes, and this bureaucracy was unyielding in some sense, right? That's one argument you're making initially. The second argument, I think, does not peacefully coexist with that. The second argument says that it's the landlords who are using criminal politicians because they can't fully rely on the state, and they want the state to remain weak. If it became Weberian, they would not be able to control as much as they do. Now, in order for both to peacefully coexist, these landlords would have to be lower caste landlords.
Some are.
But if you make a landlord-based argument, I suspect a lot of them are bhumihars and a lot of them are Thakurs and not lower caste.
But I think in places where you find, say, a Papu Yadav, my guess is you're going to find groups of, say, Yadav. There was small groups of Yadav zamindars as well. And so, for instance, there was entire caste militias fighting against Naxalites who were like Kurmi, who were Yadav. And so this is why I think you can explore this.
Let Milan respond to this. I thought there was.
Can I give one more elaboration on this?
Yeah.
No, I would say it's not that criminal. So I mean, there was during the Lalu period, there was an interest in the political elite to weaken the state, right? And so then landlords in that context had an interest from all castes, who people that had land to protect, to actually have criminal politicians that could protect them. They're facing assault both from lower caste politics as well as from So there's two different phases as well. Mm-hmm. So the pressures they faced during the Lalu period were different than the pressures they faced under Nitish Kumar.
Okay, more of this when Milan takes up these comments. Our next speaker is Adam Ziegfeld. Adam took his PhD from MIT and has been teaching at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. As an International Council Assistant Professor of Political Science, and published recently, earlier this year, Adam, or last year, right? The book, Why Regional Parties, Clientelism, Elites, and the Success of Regional Political Parties in India, Cambridge University Press. And his paper for American Political Science Association meetings a month ago, 3 weeks ago, is the only paper in my career as a commentator on which I said I couldn't find a single flaw. And I said, I tried very hard. I told the audience of about 50 people in the room, I tried very hard. This morning I spent another 15 minutes thinking about it. I couldn't find a flaw. Adam.
Are you reviewing this paper?
I hope so. I know to put on that review list. I did actually have a couple. There we go. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for that very kind introduction. And more importantly, Ashley, thank you for the invitation to be here today. Oh, no. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. This is meant to be blank. Yeah, but I don't want to distract you. There's only a couple slides. This is much later. Okay, so again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to Milan for sort of providing us with this wonderful occasion. I want to start with my remarks by talking about three of what I think are sort of the unusual achievements of this book. I think every year many fine scholars write fine books that achieve a great deal. This is undoubtedly one of them. But I think that this book does more than sort of the average good book out there. And so that's what I just want to start out focusing on. First, I think ostensibly this book asks a question about why are there so many criminals in politics. In fact, as my count, Ashu came up with 4. I think it answers at least 3. So why do criminals want to join politics? Why do parties welcome them within their fold? And then why do voters vote for them? And so I think in this sense, I think a lot of us we're interested in a big puzzle or a big topic, and we sort of take a narrow slice and try and answer it well. I think what's remarkable about this book is its breadth. I think this book aims, and I think does a very good job of really intending to be sort of the sort of cornerstone book on this topic. And so I think it is quite remarkable in its breadth. So it's not just sort of your good, well-researched, thoughtful book, but it is incredibly broad and ambitious. Second, for those of you who haven't read this book is colorful, readable, engaging. Like, these are adjectives not typically associated with your run-of-the-mill academic book. And yet at the same time, right, this is a serious piece of research. There is serious theorizing. There is some really heavy-duty empirical work here. And so the fact that this is readable, I mean, this is what we all tell our publishers, oh, the lay reader is going to love to read this. And, we deliver these books that are very in the weeds in social science debates, and not so with this book. It really, I think, has the ability to be widely read, and I think as a result sort of really inform the discussion again. So I think this is what makes this book stand apart from many others. And then the third thing is perhaps something that I think a lot about working sort of with public opinion data in India is Milan's very respectful of the Indian voter, and this is actually came out in his last point. And I think that this is, I think as people have already talked about, right, he thankfully dispenses with this notion that the problem here is information. But I think the sort of one natural response is like, well, if voters are sort of, if he's offering this affirmative case that people willingly vote for these people, I think there is a tendency in the media and some sort of the polite society in India to say like, oh, well, these people are seduced by these Robin Hood figures, or they succumb to these base casteist instincts. And I think Milan's argument about rule of law provides us with the rationale through which to understand sort of, well, this is a fairly reasonable strategy for voters who are somewhat vulnerable because they live in places where the state doesn't function the way it's supposed to. And so I think it gives us a, dare I say, sort of rational reason for why voters behave this way. And so in so doing, I think it avoids this temptation of sort of laying these problems at the doorstep of sort of, you know, low education, sort of low socioeconomic status voters, and says that there's a real reason why they're doing this and why you and I might do that too in the same context. And so I think this is I think a third sort of really important thing about the book. Okay, so having said this, really, I think there's three sort of the breadth, sort of the readability and the extent to which this is really an engaging book, and I think sort of the way that it treats the Indian voter, I think are all quite sort of remarkable and important. Okay, so having said that, I want to ask sort of three questions. The first is this a book about crime, or is this a book more broadly about rule breaking? So I thought it was very clever having thought about this until I get to page 295, and Milan talks about actually, well, there's this relationship between corruption and crime, and so clearly he's thought about this. But it is something I did still want to ask about, is whether sort of, given how concerning it is that there are people that have potentially committed very serious crimes in Parliament, I think the sort of criminality angle is a very compelling one. But it strikes me that a lot of the arguments in this book don't need to be about people that have potentially committed serious crimes. They could also be ones about people that have committed acts of corruption, which may or may not be illegal, as I'm sure you talk about in the conclusion of the book. It could also just be about simple rule breaking, right? That if it's sort of what's important here is this sort of ability to get things done for constituents. It doesn't necessarily require criminal acts. It requires a certain, I mean, it depends sort of what kind of rules are being broken and whether that is in fact sort of a violation of the Indian Penal Code. But I think more broadly, it strikes me that this is not just about crime, but potentially quite a bit wider about a sort of wide range of behaviors that are consistent with rule breaking. And again, this can be sort of banal rule breaking up to sort of, you know, breaking rules against not killing people, so sort of big rules. But so I guess I sort of wanted to ask about sort of the extent to which you think that this does apply a little bit more broadly than just beyond sort of criminality. Now, my second two questions are actually about a part of the book that at the beginning that Milan didn't actually talk too much about in his presentation, so I hope I don't sort of derail the discussion too much. But my second question is about whether the incidence of politicians with coercive power has really increased. So Ashu alluded to this in his comments at the beginning, that sort of Milan says, I can't remember which chapter now, that right, what's changed, there's always been a crime-politics nexus in India. What's changed is that previously there was a quid pro quo between criminals and politicians. The criminals provided the muscle at election time, and afterwards the politicians provided protection. And that this was sort of a stable state of affairs so long as you had this Congress-dominant period when the politicians knew, or the criminals knew who they could get behind for protection. But as this Congress-dominant system breaks down, criminals decide, hey, I need to actually just go into politics myself. And so there's this claim here about sort of the increase in the incidence of a certain type of politician. And I certainly wouldn't quibble with the idea that sort of the biographical details of this certain type of dabang politician have changed. But I was wondering, and again, I thought I was super clever until I got to page 304 and you started talking about landlords, and I was like, okay, so he's thought about this point too. But again, I will bring it up anyway. And my thinking is, you know, when I read about sort of politics in the 1950s and sort of landlords and local notables elected to parliament, you know, one often thinks that these are people that were, as I think Jeff talked about, sort of, they were the ones who sort of were the rulers in their area. And I think there is an implication that many of these people would resort to coercion. Maybe they didn't need to because there were sort of traditional notions of deference towards the upper caste or towards landlords. But these to me seem very similar in sort of their underlying type to these sort of dabang-style politicians. And so my question really is sort of, and I know that this is a little unfair because we're hamstrung by lack of data to sort of really comprehensively answer this question, but it does make me wonder whether or not there's really been a change in the types of politicians that comprise Indian legislatures, or if what's really changed is sort of we move from these sort of landed elites who are willing to use coercion to sort of keep the lower caste down or to sort of suppress any types of push for land reform, and are willing to use coercive means, to those whose coercive means sort of come out through local mafias and things like that. And sort of if there's an incidence in crime, sort of criminality, is this sort of a breakdown of sort of traditional norms, that there's just more reporting of it? I'm trying to think about whether or not we had the same types of politicians earlier. They just, again, their biographical details might have been a little bit different, but their willingness to sort of crack heads to get things done may not necessarily have been all that different. And so I think there's an implication here for sort of like, if things didn't change as much, then sort of, how do we then explain the sort of supply of criminal politicians? And then my third question is along similar lines. It has to do, again, with this argument about political competition and the role that that plays. And my question here is sort of, what aspects of competition are central to creating the supply of politicians? And the argument that Milan makes is about, again, this sort of breakdown of the dominant party system in India. And I think it's unambiguous that there was a period at the national level from 47 to 77, in many states from 47 to 67, and some states beyond, where Congress was continuously in power, right? And that has unambiguously changed. But I think that there are some ways, when we think about political competition, depending how we define political competition and dominance, where there are actually some surprising continuities. And so I guess it's sort of a call to sort of ask you a little bit more about sort of what it is that sort of these would-be criminal politicians are looking for in terms of protection, and whether it's knowing that the Congress is going to form the government and therefore control the Home Ministry, or whether it's having your sort of political patron necessarily win. So just to sort of follow up on this, I will use any instance to sort of geek out with election data. So what I did was I actually looked at margins of victory in state level elections. So this is just the winner's percentage minus the runner-up percentage. And looked at these are from major state elections from 1951 through 2008. These are box plots. The white lines here are the means, so the mean margin of victory. And then the whiskers here are the standard deviation. And you can see that sort of this reference line is 10%. So you can see is that the margins of victory have gone down a little bit over time. But I think if you sort of broad brushstrokes, this is not actually quite as different as I think we might expect, given that this is a period when sort of we associate with Congress dominance in 1950s. In the 2000s, it's quite competitive. And so from this point of view, depending what we mean by political competition, things have gotten a little more competitive, but it isn't necessarily this sea change that we sort of associate with the fact of Congress' sort of long time in power versus sort of in this period of at least alternation, or where Congress in some cases has fallen off the map. Alternatively, if we sort of take, again, a different notion of sort of competitiveness and look at sort of turnover, I tried to match constituencies from 1957 round of state elections in India, and the 1960 to 62, depending what state you're in. And I wasn't able to match all of them based on name, but basically what this says is about 40% of constituencies Congress won in 1957, and then won again in 60-62. And then about 17% the opposition won in 1957, and then won again in 60-62. But what this means is that 43% of these seats, even during this Congress dominant period, change hands. Either this 23% that Congress won in 57, but then they lost in the subsequent election, or the reverse, that the opposition won in 57 and then lost. And so the point here is just that even when Congress is winning, so if you add these up, sort of seats won by Congress at 63% and 57, it's 60%, right? Congress is still winning the majority of seats, but which seats they're winning actually shifts quite a bit. So if you're a criminal politician, this suggests that the certainty with which sort of you know that your potential patron is going to win is not necessarily super high. There's a pretty decent chance that in any given constituency, the congressperson might lose, even having won in the previous period. And so I think there are certain ways of thinking about competition and dominance that I think are entirely consistent with sort of the argument here. I think there are others where there's actually a surprising amount of continuity between this sort of dominant period and the more competitive period. And so for me, it's sort of, I think, this just sort of returns to this question of sort of what elements of competition are really central to sort of driving people from being the criminal who provides this muscle, but is not himself, or herself, usually himself, a politician, to this decision to actually enter in to the electoral fray. So, thanks.
Our final commentator is Prerna Singh, who does not need much introduction for this audience. She's my colleague in political science and at Watson Institute, Mahatma Gandhi Assistant Professor of Political Science and of Public and International Affairs, and who published multiple prize-winning book earlier this year. No, last year. Yes. And so Prerna on Milan. Yeah. Do you need this too? No.
Thank you, Ashu. And I want to start by saying how deeply fortunate I feel to be part of an unprecedented cohort of political scientists who are working on South Asia and India in particular. And this cohort is distinguished. We're not anthropologists. For those of you who are anthropologists, political science has not had this kind of, vital, lively, collegial group who work in our subdiscipline of comparative politics. And this new cohort is really transforming the way that the subdiscipline of comparative politics broadly thinks about some of its most critical bread and butter issues, whether that's political parties, electoral politics more broadly, ethnic politics, public goods provision, claim making, brokers, technology. And so it is a sign of and a testimony, I think, to the vitality of that milieu that we find ourselves here today fetting and discussing Milan's new book. And within even this exciting field of social science and this study of contemporary India, Milan's book stands out for all the reasons that Adam laid out and Jeff alluded to as well. It first of all draws our attention to a phenomenon, and I speak more for myself, that even for those of us who try to study Indian politics, came as a little bit of a revelation, which is not just the presence, but the pervasiveness of criminals in the electoral fray and their success in contemporary India. It's, as again Jeff and Adam have and Ashu have already said, it's an elegant and a comprehensive theory based on this demand and supply, and it's a combination of painstaking data collection and analysis as evidenced by those three bulky appendices that Jeff also alluded to, as well as these fine-grained lived experiences of constituencies represented by Bahubalis or strongmen. And these case studies are as engaging as they are persuasive. And so, it's not just a careful, thoughtful analysis of what leads to this pervasiveness of criminality in Indian politics. It also does a remarkably good job of actually telling us what the implications are for contemporary Indian politics. And so I want to say at the outset, perhaps much like Ashu said for Adam's APSA paper, which obviously I now immediately want to read, which is that this was a really hard book to have a critical response to. And for those of you who generally know my tack in these book addas, that's saying something. And part of the reason why I had a hard time coming up with critical responses is because I had a very hard time reading it. And that was because I had to fight my father daily for it. So my father was in the Indian Administrative Service for 35 years, and he recently retired as head of UNESCO's East Asia office. And now in his retirement, he's visiting his granddaughter, who also happens to live in Providence. And every night when I would try to get this book, it would be, smuggled somewhere. And you can see from the number of Post-its how much ownership he got. The blue Post-its are his, the pink are mine. And, given that he was getting much more quality time with this, I would ask him each night at dinner, so what did you think of the book? Do you have any critical comments? And he would be like, yeah, brilliant, game-changing, powerful, courageous. And sometimes he would resort to bureaucrat talk. He'd be like, he dots all the I's and he crosses all the T's. And then I finally told him, I said, you're supposed to be helping me. And he was like, no, it's too good. And so, I say this as I begin my comments. So what I'm going to do today is to use your book as a springboard to think more broadly and beyond. And so I'm going to raise 6 questions very quickly in 10 minutes. But in the spirit both of democracy and Adda, and also to signal the richness of this particular intellectual milieu that you find yourself in today, which is the Center for Contemporary South Asia, I'll divide my remaining 5 minutes, and Ashu can police, between 2 astute observers of Indian politics who have experienced elections on the ground as a bureaucrat on election duty and as a journalist covering and reporting and studying elections. So 5 minutes of my time will be with Bhanu Joshi and 5 minutes with Abhimanyu Singh. So I'll begin by raising this question. Milan, that map that you put up, which is this question of regional variation. And I think you do a really nice job of telling us that this expectation that we have of somehow Southern politics being cleaner, more robust, and governance generally functioning better doesn't hold, because this kind of criminality is pretty widespread across the map of India. And yet, if you look at that map, some things still strike you. And I haven't thought enough about this to really exactly have a theory, but I want to kind of put forward a few ideas. So the one thing I noticed, of course, firstly, maybe because I'm from Rajasthan and study Rajasthan, is the kind of relative absence of criminality in Rajasthan politics. And we have someone who also studies Rajasthan politics here. And so I was just wondering whether this has something to do with the fact that local landholders, former zamindars, former princes have been much more prominent in Rajasthani politics. And so this gets to both Jeff and Adam's point about, how do we think of these new criminal politicians as compared to these old local strongmen. But the other kind of perhaps even more striking finding was this remarkable absence of criminal politicians in the two areas of India that have witnessed deep political insecurity and secession in about the same point in time that you're studying. So, I don't know what you have to say about this, but Kashmir and the Northeast, right? Like, these look like two areas that really haven't produced to the same degree these MPs who have serious criminal records. And so is there something perhaps theoretically that we can think about having a kind of army presence, about being in a state of, in a sense, occupation, what does it mean, or maybe is it something about the undermining of an electoral process in these places? What does it mean? Is there a reason why less criminals enter the fray? Or are they less likely to get elected? So I'm just wondering if you can kind of help us think through that theoretically about this intersection of political crisis, almost of kind of military occupation, and the lack of criminality in the electoral fray. So sticking with this question of spatial variation, I was also wondering that if the theory, at least in terms of the supply of these politicians, is that elections are becoming increasingly costly, and that's why you see these criminals entering the fray because they have deep pockets, then I'm wondering, again, are elections equally costly across different parts of India? Is there something about how much elections cost or how much money people on average put into them that might then explain again some of this regional variation, which I agree does not fit expected patterns, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so I'm almost wondering if you can give us a new way, kind of carve out our geography a little bit different from these kind of conventional north-south patterns, but I still think there is a kind of regional spatial angle to this. The second point I want to make is, are you fundamentally changing our understanding of the role of political competition in democracies? And what I mean by this is, are you turning our received understanding of political competition as essentially being a desirable element? You said, you seem to echo this because you said that your understanding is that in India, we don't just contest elections, we fight them, right? And that's somehow it's just meant to indicate that it's a more robust system. This is a vibrant democracy. People have more choice. Pradeep Chibber and Irfan Nuruddin would argue that more competition means better public goods provision. Steve Wilkinson might argue that more political competition means less ethnic violence. But is there a way to read your argument that actually political competition perhaps makes races more expensive? Right? People have to put in more money when you are in a kind of tight electoral race, which then kind of increases the likelihood of the emergence of criminal politicians. So I'm just, and you talk a little bit about political competition in your book, but I'm just wondering, is there a way in which we can push you into, are you kind of asking us to question received generally positive understandings of political competitions in democracy? Sticking with this theme of political competition, I just want to push you into this kind of dystopic vision that your book almost leads us towards, and actually Jeff's pulling out of that appendix, which I'd also looked at, which is that 40% of MPs in Bihar have criminal records. MPs or MLAs? MPs? MLAs have criminal records. So maybe actually this dystopic future is a much nearer future than we imagine. But I'm just wondering, so the institutions that are going to change to stop criminality from being this kind of pervasive presence in Indian politics is not happening. 40% of MLAs in Bihar have criminal. Oh, sorry?
Of BJP.
Of BJP, right? But it's pretty high even for a lot of the other parties, right?
It's pretty high. Overall could be 30%. But
Exactly,
that's very high.
right? But can you then lead to a situation in which actually there are two criminal politicians contesting each other? And I don't know if you actually address this in the book, but I'm just wondering, can you kind of talk us through that? Because it seems as if we are kind of headed there. No, so then like, I don't know what my expectations would be in that kind of situation. Fourthly and quickly, you tell us a lot about this idea that, criminal politicians are pervasive. We know that they have a better chance of getting reelected, but we don't hear much about their performance. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little about this. We certainly hear the voices of the supporters who seem to think that, they're building roads, they're generally kind of, bringing development, they're bringing vikas. We also hear the voices of the criminal politicians that we are getting things done, we are agents of change, we fill in where the state fails the people. But we still don't, given what a meticulous book this is, I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about, do these, according to some kind of objective indicators, do these criminal politicians actually do what the people think they're doing and they themselves seem to be suggesting they get elected? Point number 5, and I'm almost at the end, is that, how do things change? How do we get out of this mess? And I'll question a little bit about whether this is really as much of a mess as we think it is. And I'm wondering here whether case studies of other countries could tell us a little about this. So for example, you mentioned on page 164 very fleetingly this example of Italy. And I was a little surprised that a country like Italy didn't figure more prominently, because I would have thought that the role of the mafia and local strongmen and bahubalis, there might be more there than you kind of bring out. But I just want to think here of Italy as this case that might shed light on how do we get out of this hole that Indian politics is in. Because you say that voters used to elect deputies who had these kind of criminal records up until the 1990s, right? But then things changed. So then I was curious, you use Italy as an example of saying voters are not, the ignorant voter hypothesis doesn't hold. And in the Italian case, you say actually they stopped electing these criminal deputies because the media began to focus more on them. So actually Italian voters got more information and they stopped voting for criminals. That doesn't hold in India. So then, but does that kind of exhaust the utility of such a case study? Given that, what we really want to see is an example of where criminal politicians used to be elected and then stopped getting elected and things changed. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit. And again, Italy, because the conditions of institutional change that you lay out for criminals to stop being elected have arguably not happened, right? Institutions of law enforcement and governance in Italy are weak, at least relative to other parts of Western Europe. So if that hasn't changed, and if you kind of question this whole information gets voters to kind of, stop voting for criminals, then what else is there? And I feel as if these kind of case studies of when things change could be a fruitful avenue of inquiry. And I want to end with this question of how bad really are things? And this echoes to some extent Jeff and Adam's point. Aren't these new criminal politicians just new types of strongmen? So we've been reading Joel Migdal in class, and this idea that local landlords and zamindars, and you explicitly talk about the legacy of zamindars, but can't we just see these criminal politicians as new forms of local strongmen who are now contesting elections? And I think this, even more after Jeff's remarks, linking these bahubalis in Bihar to actual landholding patterns and local landlords. Because we don't really hear in this book about how the criminal background of politicians affects either the way that they contest elections or how they rule after winning, right? So you say in the beginning, Papu Yadav has the physique of a baby elephant, right? Perhaps that much was obvious from the photograph. Interestingly, even after he comes out of jail. But this idea that he doesn't really behave like in that raging stampede fashion, right? Like, so if criminal politicians are not behaving like criminals when they contest elections or when they win, instead what we hear are people attesting to criminals like Anant Singh actually protecting them, then in a sense, how different are these criminal politicians from other politicians who also have some pretty unsavory elements to their personalities? And you kind of waver between this, no? You kind of say that, to one extent, on one side, the existence of these criminal politicians signals this deep crisis of governability. And on the other hand, you say, but if you really hear the voters, these are rational voters who are voting for people who are going to, do good by them. And you say, they do good by doing bad, right? Is that the way? But there doesn't really seem to be much evidence of the doing bad. And so, at least in the winning of the elections, there's no stealing of ballot boxes, there's no kind of strong arming of voters, and at least even in your description of the way they govern. And so I'm just wondering that is it the reason that you still kind of are conflicted between describing this as a crisis of governability and between saying that this is a route to partial accountability? Is it that you're wavering? Because maybe by actually letting voters have the last word, by seeing criminal politicians as local strongmen who are contesting elections because they're rich and elections are expensive, and they're winning because they're getting things done, does that in some small but fundamental way take away from the significance of studying money and muscle in Indian politics? Thank you. So I'm going to call, is it okay, Ashu?
What?
Did I call Bhanu and, I only spoke for 10, right?
No, they can surely, we can give them 5 minutes.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah.
So
We
Bhanu,
can-
do you want to come first?
Yeah.
Bhanu wrote an excellent book review of Milan's book
Okay.
for my class.
Yeah, yeah,
and so-
sure.
I mean, in my defense, I finished this review last night and I sent it to her this morning.
Shall I hold this for you?
And
You
then,
might
no,
fall.
that's fine.
Yeah, please.
And then I got an email about an hour back saying that, hey, stand up and speak. And I've not been, I've not been in graduate school for long, but I do know when your professor says, do this, you better do it.
A strong woman has said this.
Well, she has a very good point about gender.
So I have 3 points, and I think most of them were raised. So I'll just stick to 2 of them. The first one is about gender, and I think that I really feel that there's a missing gendered lesson in the book, and I'm saying this not because it's fashionable, but because I genuinely think so, and there are 3 reasons for it. Number one, during my sort of field visits in Bihar and UP, I did figure out that a lot of women, strong women, are emerging, and I have Gulabi gang in in UP, in Bundelkhand, UP, and then of course Safi Amma in Triveniganj in Bihar. Now, of course, their motivation and appeal are different, but I think I'm forced to think again and again. And when I think of Mayawati and Jayalalitha, there is some amount of, and then you come back to the 2 sort of examples that you have in the book about Anand Singh and Papu Yadav. Most of them have had women act as proxies, either as campaigners or later sometimes put in position of power. And I also want to take this argument a little further by saying that, any student who studies Indian politics would vouch that women candidates are set up all across, from panchayats to assembly to national elections, by men, usually strong men. And to buttress that point, there are 239,000 panchayats in India. Each of them has 5 elected members. 1/3 of these seats are reserved for women. Rotation happens every 5 years, which means that there has to be some amount of, there needs to be a serious engagement with what motivations and what do these women panchayat leaders who then act as proxy do. The second point is, which I think was raised by Jeff and then Prerna also sort of raised it, which is about, you talk about elections as a marketplace, right? There's a supply side and there's a demand side. I really like the supply side arguments in the book. I think The interviews provide a very nice context to what that supply side mean. But I was left for a little. I was wanting for more on the demand side. And when I say what I mean by the demand side is the following. Like for instance, I don't know what the motivation of voters in Mokama are only limited to service provisioning. How are the local networks and systems in Mokama any different from Tigri constituency, which borders it, right? Similarly, I think Jeff made that point about, is it something about the environment? Is it something about let me just pull out something which I was doing while I was sitting here in the,
Why are you doing this? The first point is that women can be strong,
so, yeah. So
can
this
behave
is-
like strong men, or they are proxies for strong men. And they make strong men what they are. Is that the gender point?
I would say
That-
that,
that-
are
that-
women
that-
strong, I mean, are there women Bahubalis, I guess? I mean, how do
Yeah,
they kind
s-
of, in both their buttressing, but also independent, right?
In which case, the argument would be this, that something about Indian culture which looks for strong personalities. Is that what they?
I don't know,
Anyway.
that's the question from
Yeah.
Okay. So the third point here was that, the second point here was that I'm looking at, I just pulled up Madhubani. I also pulled up Katihar. And I think both Prerna and Jeff's point that what happens when you have so many candidates and the winning candidate actually is not with any criminal record, right? So the point being that I'm not very clear if criminality and money in itself explains winnability. There are a lot. So, for instance, this area which I was looking at, Katihar, Madhubani, has historically had CPI-ML activism, and Jeff and you would know much better that the party is usually associated with fighting, with killing and winning, and so on and so forth. So yeah, and the point that I think you wanted. I mean, the first point was that I would really like to know more about the motivation or appeals of women Bahubalis. And we have good examples. Mayawati and Jayalalitha, I think, is a good example who ruled over very diverse and complex and contested political environment and had money behind them, or were at least maintaining some sort of a system in place. Okay.
This is an easy point to handle, though.
Yeah.
So his argument is about the central tendency.
Mm-hmm.
You have picked up an outlier.
Yeah.
There would have to be unless this repeats itself again and again, it
Yeah.
won't undermine
I
the
mean,
point he's making, right?
I just looked at Madhuban and Katihar.
I mean,
but-
he would
but
still
let-
have to say
yeah.
something about why it's an exception.
I can give just a
Yeah.
really quick example in kind of my research area, just at the state assembly election, where
Thank you.
there was like, I think 3 criminal candidates. I think 2010, the one who wasn't won, right?
You could have.
But then because he didn't have access to any of the networks that were central to everything happening there, and kind of he was considered worthless, and then he lost in the last election. Yeah.
Okay. Anandita? Is she
no,
speaking? No.
Abhimanyu.
Abhimanyu speaking.
Or Oni.
Abhimanyu Singh gets the chance to speak. Okay. As a retired civil servant from the rather peaceful state,
No, as an election observer in Bihar.
and as an election observer, okay.
Yeah.
How much time would you like? 5 minutes? Okay.
About, yeah.
Okay.
Some might say this is nepotism, but I've been studying Prerna's book and reading it over the last 2-3 days, and I must say it's quite
If you were a dad who had never observed an election, that would be nepotism. But you're a dad who's observed the state election, not only one election, but many elections,
I
because
see.
you were a
Yeah.
civil
I was going to
servant.
say it's a guy
Okay.
who read Milan's book more
Okay,
closely
and
than
your
I
5 minutes are justified then.
Actually, this is dynastic politics.
In reverse.
Yeah, so I might stretch the 5 minutes here, taking advantage of the goodwill. Okay, so I think it's unputdownable. It's a realistic picture from my experiences of conducting elections in 70s. The first one, the historic 77, then 1980, and right up to 2000, including being in the center of Bihar, where one of your observations, where Session, whom we called Al Session, the then election commissioner who wanted to change society through changing elections almost. And he was insisting that all the arms and ammunition that people have should be deposited in police stations, and then in the process of doing so, I think we ran out of space, showing the limitations of what can be done overnight. And then we thought that was the end of the story until we came to the counting hall a few weeks later. And then we saw that every other person was carrying a gun for counting, not for polling. And so this is altogether new challenge. Yeah, it was 91, the year when Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. Right. So we had to really say, what the hell? We had to postpone counting for half a day. And after all the sweat and the labor and the threats and so on, while driving back to the airport, a guy said, "Sir, aap to chale jayenge. Kal se to yahi aise hi chalta hai." So the role of election commission is central to your book, and as it should be. But I think one of the issues that probably has to be dealt with is that it doesn't collapse under its own weight and expectations. You see some rumblings now that certain kind of people are being pushed into the election commission by the ruling dispensation. That is a disturbing point. The other is that at the state level, we haven't built an independent machinery. During elections, the whole state machinery comes under the purview of the election commission, and they, you might say in inverted commas, behave. But then you revert to what is business as usual. So is there a scope here in your reform of electoral governance to really look at the issue of election commission, not only at the national level, but at the state level? There has been a movement in this direction where you have state election commissions to conduct the now statutory panchayat elections. Whether that can be beefed up to see that you have a more permanent, more professional, more impartial election machinery in every state to support the election commission, which is looking slightly vulnerable from the outside, I think, right now. The other issue is about going back to the gender issue. In your case studies, which are very riveting, and I think each one could be a script for a film, and there have been films. You mentioned Dabang, you mentioned Gangs of Wasipur, and so on. You don't see a single woman. There is no woman Bahubali. Not a single one. There may have been Fulan Devis and so on, and there have been people in power who are alleged to be extremely corrupt. Some names were mentioned. But if that is the way out, then if you link it with the demand for reservation and quota for women, if political parties and others and the public perceive that women are less corrupt and are less liable to be criminal in their approach to electoral politics, then is there an indirect link between this issue of quota for women candidates and powerful men? The third is about the composition of the civil service, which point is linked to my first point. If you look at the composition of the civil service in any state, most of them belong to that state, whether it's Rajasthan, Bihar, UP. The state civil services hold sway. The All India services, which are basically the IAS and IPS in this context, are really the tip of the iceberg. And what is happening now is that only 10% or so, maximum of them, I'm just using a rough ballpark figure, go to the center or stay there. So there is a complete provincialization of the state services. And the longer you stay in services during election time and when the crunch comes, you are likely to be more vulnerable to pressure. So the whole issue of how the civil services were conceived and how they are working now, it has to be rethought. This whole insider-outsider component. And within the IAS and IPS now you find, because of the pressure from below, and we cannot deny opportunities to others, state service promotees who belong to the same state are dominant. So the scope for All India service officers to acquire a national, international perspective and then come back and benefit the state, as was the idea, it has gone awry. And the last point, I think, which you make in passing, but I think needs to be made, coming to India after 15 years, is the massive impact of media. TV particularly, but also social media. But you don't say much in your book about how that can be used to the advantage of the public good.
Or can be used by
Or it is now,
by the
yeah,
strongmen.
yeah. I mean, this whole case of Ram Rahim shows, I think is a case, could be a case study by itself as to how the media behaved and how it projected this person, and how I think the public perception against him and also against the failure of state was shaped by what was shown or not shown on TV. So I think the whole issue of the role of media is extremely important in going forward and maybe dealing with this issue in a way that hasn't quite been done yet. And social media, of course, it played a very important role in these incidents.
Well, how are state promotees? You mean promotees into IAS from state civil service?
Yeah, yeah.
How are they central? I mean, that's the part I didn't.
So this is it. You see,
You're given more power. To,
so
The Election Commission works
so
for them.
most of us are directly recruited by the Union Public Service Commission.
yeah, of course.
They are not.
I know. I understand.
They are promoted from the state
and they're
service.
given more prominence within the.
No, see, they don't go out of the state then.
Oh, it's.
So that all India thing is
And
diluted.
it's increasing, you're saying?
Yes,
I
it's
didn't realize
increasing.
it
It's
was
increasing because of the pressures from below. It is increasing, and so I think these are some of the issues. Just
Thank you.
yeah, I finished.
What?
I wasn't going on.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes left. Let me propose the following. 5 minutes, we can see what questions are there from the floor, and we give you 5 minutes to respond. Right. Now, there is no other way. We can extend up to 5 minutes after 4, but all our staff is contractually bound. So we can maybe go up to 5 after 4, because they have to leave at a certain
You're also cutting into drinking time. If
Yeah,
you
yeah.
do that.
So at best till 5 after 4, right? And so are there questions from the audience? I can see David Scarwick, David studies prisons. He's my new colleague, and he's made his career studying prisons. David.
So, fantastic presentation. It looks like a wonderful project. I'm going to run to my office afterwards, and after the wine, and crack open the book. So 2 questions. Apologies if you address them in the book. One is you sort of suggested that somebody running with a criminal case increases the electoral success of other people on the ticket. I thought that's what you said, and I thought that was very interesting. And I wonder if you have the data where you could estimate how much that is. Either just a simple difference in means, but if a random person is on or not on a ticket with a criminal case, that would be fascinating to know. The second.
Should I just answer that one quickly because I have it? So what I meant to say is that one of the attractions to political parties is that candidates who are deep-pocketed will come and say, I will subsidize other candidates. But I haven't looked at whether or not the candidates that they subsidize, then their network spreads to them. But you could do that.
Something that you could do, and it'd be fascinating. The other thing that came to mind is just that, if I understand you correctly, the implication is if you were somehow able to prohibit anyone with a criminal case from running, then governance might actually worsen if people think these are the best for the job. And one way that you could test that would be just a simple regression discontinuity design that takes people with criminal cases who just barely win versus those regions where they just lose. And you could compare either the output or the subsequent electoral success to see what the consequence was.
Other questions? Yeah. Palumi and then Hani here. Let me go first.
I'll keep it very, very brief. So my question is about the demand side of the equation. And I wonder, because your argument is that the reason that people vote for criminals is because of poor governance, the state doesn't function. But yet the map that you showed earlier, there seem to be criminal politicians everywhere, even in states that seem to be well functioning in, say, Kerala, Tamil Nadu. And I wonder if you have some sort of theory because for that, because it could be just that the cases against those politicians might not be as serious as the ones that you see in Bihar and UP, but like I was just curious about the map that you had earlier.
Yeah, that was actually pretty much my question about exploring the link between sort of strong societies, strong states, and in some cases weak states and strong societies. And really, I feel like your argument kind of goes both ways, depending on which state we're talking about. And I mean, whether it's a Kerala we're talking about or whether it's a Bihar we're talking about. So one is the black box of the state itself, and does that change depending on which part of the country we're looking at this relationship at? And secondly, yeah, so maybe just actually, yeah, I'll stop there. I think that was just an add-on question.
Just it.
This is related to Pauline's question as well, you know, thinking
This,
about.
this is not a fair question because Aiden is a graduate student at MIT who helped me with the book, so.
But this is like external to the book, I guess. You know, when you think about like the criminal politicians in Kerala, you can think about a different type of violence that leads to serious crimes there. They're not necessarily doing the like unseen like business development or administrative or organized criminal violence. But there is another type of like more internal to politics violence that's happening in
RSS
Kerala.
versus the Marxists.
Yeah. So should this have the same effect on constituents when you've got this violence internal to politics versus this violence that's kind of external to electoral politics?
And I have a question, but I will suspend it if somebody else has it. Okay, so if there's supply demand, I think you've heard this before. I want to see what your answer is. I don't think maybe you answered and I don't remember. If there is supply via discretionary, expendable, distributable money, that's how criminals are coming in. And there's demand because they deliver, especially in highly socially divided settings. The criminal politicians deliver, state is not delivering. So standard economic theory would say there has to be an equilibrium between supply and demand. And so why does the equilibrium stop at 20%? Why doesn't it go to 75%? Right? If they're delivering, and they are the ones who have the money to fight elections and the money to give to the party also, right? Then why is it that we are stopping at 20%, even in your parliamentary, in the 2014, the most serious case, 20%, right? Vicious cases. The serious is the real issue. What you're calling serious cases are the real issue. Murder, right? And attempted murder, sexual assault, rape, all of that. So that's 20% also, something like that in your, right?
21, yeah.
So if these guys, the really serious guys, are able to deliver because they can unblock the state, unblock the unyielding state, then why does it stop at 20%? The equilibrium could go up to 50, 60. We have to have an explanation of why it's stopping there. Okay, sir. So we'll go, we have 10 minutes for you. How about we'll stop
Oh my
at 5
God.
after 4. Yeah.
Okay. First, let me say I've done a lot of talks on this book throughout the year. I have never had as many comments or as rich a set as comments as I've gotten today from all of you and from all of you up here. And Prerna, thank you so much. I can't possibly do justice. Let me just quickly run through as many as I possibly can, and then we'll handle as many as we can offline. Very quickly, I totally agree with the point that the color of money for criminals is different from the color of money of politicians. I think that's an important point. One is that they have liquid resources that they're willing to spend that are typically not necessarily locked up into long-term investments. The second is that they tend to be sons of the soil. Quite often, these are not carpetbaggers who can readily transfer themselves from the northern districts of Bihar to the southern districts of Bihar, because they have those local connected networks. And the third is that campaign period in India is a 3-week race to the finish. Obviously, there's some electioning which happens before then, but that's the true campaign period. You need a ready-made organizational platform, which many criminals do because they have a network that they then transform temporarily into an election fighting machine, and then it recedes. So that's one. I think on the history, I didn't talk about it at all in the presentation because it would have gone over 25 minutes, but there's a chapter devoted to the evolution. And the point I make over there is that the nexus between crime and politics is quite old, but there has been a change over time from criminals being on the periphery of politics to them being a center stage. the decline of Congress, the politicization of state institutions, the rising identity politics, the increase in black money, thanks to Mrs. Gandhi, prohibiting all corporate donations, which effectively pushed all funding underground. But the other point I make, and I think it's an important concept, if you want another economic concept, is that of vertical integration, right? Basically, at the point where we get to the emergency period or thereabouts, local politicians had accumulated, local criminals had accumulated so much clout that they decided, I don't need this politician middleman. He's getting the status, he's getting the money, he's getting the acclaim. Why don't I cut that person out? And internalize all of the risks. Because if I sign up with Ashu and Ashu loses, then people are going to have it out for me. So I didn't enter into any of that discussion today, but it is in the book. On the period about, you had a really provocative question about growth. And if things are doing better in Bihar, why do we see more criminals?
Right.
And all of these criminals have become entrenched, right? So it's not like they just suddenly showed up. They have been around. And Nitish Kumar has not had the political will or the capacity to take them on, right? All of these people we mentioned, Anant Singh is the only one who lost his ticket. Sunil Pandey, right? All of these people were JDU or NDA folks.
A lot of them went from kidnapping to road contractors.
Right, so I think
That was
this
actually-
addresses the dystopia question. If you want to know what the future of Indian politics looks like, my best guess is it's going to look something like American politics, which is Anant Singh isn't interested in the kidnapping for hire. He owns marketing complexes. He has a contracting business. He wants to be a banya. And so the analogy I've used before, for those of you who like cinema, is the evolution in India that they're seeing now, you're already seeing in the richer states, whether it's Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat, is the transition from Godfather 1 to Godfather 3. Right? You become an illegitimate actor with black money who fully legitimates himself with clean money, which has been laundered white.
By sending children to Columbia.
Yeah, and other Ivy League universities yet
Yes,
to be
you-
named. Crime versus corruption, Adam's point, it's a Venn diagram. So most of the criminal or suspected criminals that we address in the book and that I've seen in my experience, they often do have some corruption element around them. Either taking money, taking bribes, whatever. There's a Venn diagram. What I believe is that people who are only known for their corruption do not have a long shelf life in Indian politics. That if you are taking 5 rupees of my money and putting in your own pocket, you're not delivering me anything of good. If you're an Anand Singh who may be doing some corruption, but you're also then providing some service, then I'm willing to sort of let that slide. And I think oftentimes we have models in political economy about, I'm willing to make a trade-off between, say, probity and competence, or uprightness and competence. I'm willing to hold my nose and vote for somebody who might not be upright because they're competent. I think the Indian case challenges us to think about this in a very different way. The fact that you're not upright is actually a sign that you're competent, right? Which is a much, much tougher thing to get your head around. I think just to finish the growth point about where we're likely to see Indian politics go and Bihari politics, as we talked a lot about Bihari UP politics, is probably more into the white collar element. Pratap Bhanu Mehta has this line which says the joke about Bihar is not that there's too much corruption, it's that there's too little, right? Because you're fighting around, what did Lalu get prosecuted for? Inventing fake livestock, right? Because you didn't have a port to build, you didn't have an infrastructure to build, you didn't have big ticket corruption to get involved in. So all you could do was make up fake, granary and livestock.
It was called Bhusa Chori.
Now, I think the most complicated point, and the one that still confounds me, is the point about regional variation. I think that there is a general correlation across states between the salience of ethnic divisions and support for criminality. I have a figure in the book which demonstrates that based on surveys. There's another correlation which is not in the book, which should have been but had to pare down, which shows on some proxies of general governance, or control of corruption by state, there is a relationship. You see more crime in more poorly governed states. However, one of the things that I realized, and unfortunately I don't have the data to make this claim, and it's partially dealing with the realities of the paucity of data in India at a sufficiently disaggregated level, is how much heterogeneity there is within states, right? And I'm sure, Prerna, I mean, you've more than anyone has thought about, state level politics. I mean, I was surprised in a place like Andhra Pradesh, right? I mean, you go to Rayalaseema, where YSR was from, and a lot of it reminds you of Bihar. My own state, where my family's from, in Gujarat, you go to Junagadh, you go to the western reach of Saurashtra, the reach of the state actually is visibly changed from when you left in Ahmedabad or Baroda. And in fact, one of the most prominent god mothers in politics is Santok Ben Jadeja, who was in Porbandar and ran that like a mafia kingdom. In fact, they made the movie Godmother after her. I didn't focus on women. Maybe it's an oversight simply because when I was out there, I didn't see that many women strong men. But to your point that a lot of these women may be set up, by other men. I think that's true, but most of the men I've encountered were set up by other men, right? I mean, the whole thing about these political dynasties is, in fact, that they're backed by other men. So I don't know, I don't have a very clean answer about the gender, other than in my experiences traveling around, I didn't encounter as many. And maybe that's changed because of women's reservation more recently. I think your question about...
Esther Duflo's point is that women politicians are necessarily different. And I do think it needs to be challenged, but and empirically we'll have to show that whether that's true or not. But her argument, famous argument, is that women politicians at the local level are necessarily different. Think about different things, right? Think about different projects, etc. Not masculine projects. You should talk about feminine projects, child rearing, Anganwadi, etc. Things like that, as opposed to big roads, etc. Water, as opposed to big roads. So, so there is an argument that she's made. Yeah, okay.
I think. Sorry. On the one other thing on Prerna's point of regional variation, and I don't know the Northeast or Jammu and Kashmir as well as I should, but it is true that there are many parts. So in the Northeast, one thing I often heard from IS officers and police officials is that many of these people have been given amnesty in exchange for participating in the national political mainstream, and so therefore they do not have, they may have some criminal bona fides, but they don't necessarily show up. And I think there are a number of states, Jammu and Kashmir, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, where there has been insurgency, where a lot of the people who would make up the so-called criminals actually decide to exit from official politics because they have this other, extremist angle, which requires more follow-up. So let me just end with 2 or 3 points, because I think we're out of time, which are really about the failings of the book and I think where the research frontier is. I think one is this question about other cases and other countries. Prerna mentioned Italy. I actually think, America is a really good one, and Ashu, you're the one who raised this idea several years ago in your piece with Jan Sinha about the Gilded Age, right? A lot of similarities between turn-of-the-century American politics and what we see in India. I think the one difference is the nature of competition is so intense in India that where you see criminals in many other countries, Nigeria, Kenya, Southeast Asia, they're often behind the scenes as kingmakers, right? In India, these people have directly entered the fray. I mean, the average margin of victory in American House election, I think, is somewhere upwards of 35%, right? The figure in India is sub 10%, right? So I think that's one. The second is, I think, on the state level machinery, I agree, sir, with you entirely. I think one of the things which is deserving of inquiry is why state election commissions are so variable in their performance. And I would make the point even broader. We don't even know enough about why state level bureaucracies, I think, vary as much as they do. And I think there's actually, if any of you are PhD students, experimental work which is happening, which is worth thinking about. Some state election commissions are actually experimenting with posting affidavits outside of the polling booth on the antecedents of candidates. And so a good test of the information hypothesis may actually be collecting that data and seeing whether or not that changes voter behavior, right? I mean, I think that's a relatively clean measure of the information hypothesis. Last, but I'll just end here. I think on the performance of criminals, it's not something I do in the book, and I think the big challenge is the data. There are a couple of studies which are actually using regression discontinuity designs. There's one by Nishit Prakash et al., which finds that in areas where you have a bare criminal winner, you see lower economic growth. There's another paper which shows that you actually see lower crime because you're able to kind of keep a lid on violence in some of these places. I think the key thing, and this is why studying it is so difficult, that the bread and butter of most of these criminal politicians is not necessarily public service delivery, it's private service delivery. And when I ask them, what are the services that people come to them and want? It's things like widow's pension, it's a BPL card, it's, you know, I'm not getting a response on some piece of paper I have with the BDO or the DM, because those are things that you can give and you can also take away very easily. If I build a school that everyone can come to, how do I know that those Yadavs aren't going to infiltrate it if I'm a Bhumihar, you know? And so I think that, but that also makes the process of measurement, you know, much more complicated because the actual data sets we would use on this sort of stuff, census and SSO, others, don't capture that kind of breadth. So, thanks.
I wanted to say quite a bit, but we are absolutely out of time, and it's 4:10, and it's 4:08, and let me just briefly conclude with the remark with thanks to Milan, Prerna, Jeff, and Adam for a wonderful afternoon. Thank you. Wonderful afternoon.